This morning we continue a series of messages about the attitude of faith God calls us to have, the outlook of discipleship. Last week we talked about gratitude. This week we talk about hope, and next week we'll talk about humility. And our passages today talk about this persistent hope that followers of God show. We see this in the widow who's demanding justice from a judge. She will not stop until she gets it. This is how Jesus calls us to pray, never to give up hope, but to continue to seek what we wish from God, trusting that God, by hook or by crook, will grant some answer to our prayer in time. The same message of hope is found in the prophet Jeremiah's writings, his words to the people of Israel when they were cast away from their homeland in Israel, far away into Babylon. In the history of the Israelites, this was a devastating defeat. They had been destroyed by the Babylonians. They had been cast into exile hundreds of miles from home. From the Holy Land, they were brought all the way to what is modern-day Iraq, many hundreds of miles from their home. Their temple was destroyed. All that they knew was lost. Where would they find hope? And God says these powerful words through the prophet Jeremiah. This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. As they looked around for signs of hope and saw nothing, God said, it's within you. I'm writing my promise within you. I'm not going anywhere. I write my law or my will or what I desire for you within your hearts. Turn to it there. This was different from the way things were done in the past. Jews used to hold with them the commandments written on small, tiny pieces of paper, put in a small box, sometimes worn on their foreheads, the commandments of God, the Shema, the most important commandments they were to remember. They were invited to write them on their doorposts, right on the walls of their homes so that they could always remember that God was with them. Those reminders are all gone. What do we do when all hope is lost? When all that's familiar has been stripped away from us? God says, I will write this in your hearts. I will write it on your heart, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. We might think of the ways that we sometimes feel all is lost. I heard someone who was writing about our society saying that there's a feeling that most of what is familiar is slipping away from us. This person was talking about the mainline church and how it's declining, and Christian churches throughout the nation and around the world are often declining in their participation. And we feel like we worried that this could slip away from us. And yet, what he didn't mention is that the church still proclaims a message of hope and good news that is more needed than ever before in our society. He went on to explain that people are also afraid that our U.S. economy is going to struggle more than ever, that we've taken a turn and it does turn out that my generation is the first generation to make less money than our parents' generation for many, many years in the United States history. It's tempting to look at our future now as one that's going downhill, and yet the U.S. economy is perhaps the most stable on the face of the earth. There's still hope. A third example was just the changing of our society. We no longer live in a homogeneous Leave It to Beaver America. We have diversity around us, all around us. And yet that is also a blessing. More flavor, more color, more diversity in our world. We might consider why we feel despairing about the changes in our society. One theory that I have is that it has to do with our isolation. We don't have good practices for processing all of this change. We instead go back to our private lives. We stand in front of our screens. We play with our phones. We don't work out these differences or these changes in society any longer. We're much too isolated and individualistic. That's why this community of church is so vital for the survival of our souls, for the soul of society itself. And yet things are changing, not unlike these Israelites. We see the familiar stripped away. We see what we knew being taken away from us. We look around and things look completely different from how they used to appear. So what does God do? God says, I have not gone anywhere. I will write my law within your hearts. You only have to quiet yourselves and look within, and you will find that law, my will, my desire for your life. What a good place to write God's law within us. So often we see so much written, whether on paper or whether on the internet, where there's so much material, it can be overwhelming. We are inundated with information and supposed truths in our society. It's difficult to tell what's true and what's not, what's valuable and what's not valuable. A wonderful world's religions teacher in my college, Houston Smith, talked about how the Bible's words were written. Originally, the words were passed on through oral tradition, just like God writes it in people's hearts. The words of the Bible were passed on from one person to the next, one generation to another. And in the Bible, this is how Genesis and the earliest scriptures, some of the scriptures from Job, were probably passed on and then finally put down on paper. It was oral tradition, and our professor explained to us that that's one of the best ways for truth to be passed down. Because if things are shared verbally, we might feel that important, valuable information will be lost and people will forget it, but what actually happens is that people remember what is most important, and what is trivial and the details that don't matter become forgotten. There's a natural form of editing. Then, of course, we invented paper, where we could write down everything that we remembered and everything that we thought, and people could contain many more words in Scripture and in their sources of information. So it was more difficult to tell what is valuable, what should be kept, and what should be forgotten. And if we fast forward to today with the advent of the internet, we think of all the information that can be stored, billions and trillions of words and ideas that can be stored electronically with the help of computers and very smart people, smarter than you or me. We store this information, but what is it good for? Is it worth something? Does it speak promise? Does it speak hope to our souls? If we're not careful, we become distracted by all of this. We lose our way and we become discouraged and isolated and defeated, as those exiled, displaced Israelites felt. I experienced this once when I was visiting a church member in my first appointment in Holtville, California. If you don't know where Holtville is, don't worry, very few people do. It is in the far southeast of this state. It's the last stop before you're either in Arizona or Mexico. It gets very hot in the summertime. There are large farm plots out there in Holtville, California. One of the women that I would visit, an elderly widow who I would visit, was named Marie, and she was going blind, and she was confined to her home. I would drive out, or sometimes even ride my bicycle way out to the corner of the farm plot where Marie lived, and we would talk. She wanted me to read to her verses from her King James Bible, read the Psalms from that family Bible that she still kept. Sometimes I would arrive and I would say, Marie, how are things going? How are you feeling? And I realized she began to share more and more negative things. She'd say, well, I'm not doing very well. And I'd say, oh, why not? And she'd say things like, well, because I saw that report on the local news about that girl who was surfing in San Diego and she got bit by a shark. That was so terrible. And then she'd go on and tell me about someone who'd been kidnapped or some other violent crime that had taken place that she saw all about it on the local news. Finally, I said, Marie, I think the local news might not be a good source of information for you on a regular basis. This was the bulk of her diet. We say you are what you eat. Well, you also are what you consume on TV and in the newspapers, on the internet. She was becoming more and more discouraged and depressed. I said, Marie, if you choose to, you can watch bad news all of your life. There's plenty of it out there for you to have a steady diet every hour of the day. But I hope you won't do that. And if I may make a suggestion, I'd like to invite you to talk more with people who give you hope. Hope within your own soul. And we talked about where that might be found. I shared with her, for starters, Marie, our youth group, which is small but mighty, just painted the house of Rosalie down the street. And they did a wonderful job, and Rosalie was overjoyed at how beautiful her house looks now. And I also mentioned the Robinson family has recently decided to join the church after all these years. What a blessing that is. Oh, and the Carrot Carnival is coming up. If you didn't know, Holtville is the carrot capital of the world. If you knew that, you can raise your hand proudly. Okay, just Maria, qué bueno. Okay, all right, you and me. Okay, let's go next year. The Carrot Carnival is a spectacular event, at least in Holtville's terms, and that cheered her up a little bit too, but we needed to shift the focus to the hope and the promise within that God had offered in simple daily ways so that Marie could be encouraged and find hope for the future. This is an urgent message because we are isolated. We do become depressed and discouraged. We need to return to that hope and that promise within. God says, I will write my law within your hearts. What is the law that God would write there? What is the will that God would show us? According to Jesus, it's very simple. The greatest law is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all of your strength. And a second law is like it. He says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is what we should return to. This is the hope and promise within, and which we should share with one another. I've been proud of our church recently about how we've been sharing with our neighbors the invitation to restart the Thanksgiving tradition, which we were a part of for many years. Since 1957, I learned we were a part of a joint worship service at Thanksgiving time. It was usually the eve of Thanksgiving. And for 40 years, this was celebrated, and it was written about in the local newspapers. Anaheim United Methodist Church and Temple Beth Emet would worship together every Thanksgiving and celebrate our common heritage of faith and all that we hoped to do for the community. This tradition sadly fell off about 5 or 6 years ago, and our worship committee said we need to get back together. Of course, we had worshiped once with the other synagogue, which is Temple Beth Shalom with Rabbi Heidi Cohen. They came and visited us. But our worship committee was insistent. We have to rekindle that heritage that had been going on since 1957. So they pushed me, and I finally did it. I called Rabbi Joel Berman from Temple Beth Emet, and we had a wonderful conversation. He said, I would love to join you with whatever few people we can bring from our synagogue to worship on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, which is when we will hold that service this year. I hope you'll join us. It's a 5 p.m. service on Sunday, the 24th of November. Thanks be to God, they will join us, and we'll also have Beth Shalom. All three of us, the two temples and our church, will gather together in worship that day. This is a way that we can share that promise within once we have found that strength of God to share it with our neighbors. Let us turn to the promise, this covenant, this law within us, to love our God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor and welcome our neighbor as ourselves. Let us cherish this day on Thanksgiving, the Sunday before Thanksgiving, when we worship together. And let us find this strength so that we may speak this promise to others, so that they too may know the peace of Christ, which passes understanding. May it be so. Please pray with me. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks that you promise to be with us always, even to the end of the age. When we look around at this world and feel discouraged, when we fear that things have changed too dramatically, you remain faithful. Your love is steadfast and unchanging. You have written your promise within our hearts if we will only listen to those words above the din of society and all of the information that inundates our minds. God, as our nation progresses towards election season, as we speak to one another, let us do so in the spirit of neighborly love which Jesus has taught us. May your compassion and your peace rise above the sometimes mean-spirited conversation we hear. God, help us to seek your will in our hearts, your covenant written in our souls. Help us to see Jesus and receive his love fully so that we may respond in kind and act accordingly. God, give us this peace which we so dearly need, that we may share it with the world that dearly needs to taste and see that the Lord is good. For we pray in your blessed and holy name. Amen.